Hello, welcome to UNCAGED. I think in any discussion about Farewell, My Concubine, it's important to remember the context of how the film was made, who made the film, the interaction between what happens to individuals against the background of history is really at the core of what's happening. These days, I think people mostly know Farewell, My Concubine as a queer movie, a gay film. I don't know if it's really accurate. That takes a lot of the narrative space. But mostly you see the lives of individuals in the turmoil and the violence of history. And they themselves, as they try to improve their art, they are also caught in the violence of learning an art, their own crafts. So you have violence embedded in violence. So the film was directed by Cheung Kai-ge. Cheung Kai-ge had lived through the rough years of the Cultural Revolution. One thing happened that is at the center of the film, and according to Chen himself, he actually denounced his own father. He thought of Farewell, My Concubine as a letter of apology to his father. So that gives a singularly poignant dimension to the film, and a really personal one as well. Cheung Kai-ge himself was caught in the whirlwind of the Cultural Revolution. At the time, there was a call to go up the mountain and go down the village, take part in the agrarian movement, which is something that Chen did. He documented that moment in a film called King of the Children, and he went on to join the People's Liberation Army, another experience that he was going to turn into a film. So at that point, it's fair to say that a lot of Cheung Kai-ge's work was pretty autobiographical in nature. Farewell, My Concubine. It exists in many different forms. Originally, it was a script that was adapted for television. It was written by a writer called Lillian Li Bihua. In any case, in 1985, she turned that story into a novel. It's a brief novel. Cheung Kai-ge obviously was interested in it. The novel didn't have quite a strong grasp on what was going on in the mainland, so he asked a mainlander to join and contribute to the script. A few months later, and you have the script for Farewell, My Concubine. Later on, Lillian Li went on to revise her story further. Philosophically, her ideas are very different from Cheung Kai-ge. There's a fundamental difference between the two endings. So she felt the need to revise the novel to emphasize that difference. I think you could argue that the core of Farewell, My Concubine, that's what makes it such an interesting, powerful film, is the conflict between art and life. It's a movie about what matters more in life. Is life more important? You have to live your life, no matter how nonsensical it is, how absurd, how tragic, or can you make sense of it through the power of art? For Cheung Kai-ge, the answer is art is superior. That's what you should do, no matter also how absurd it can feel. For Lillian Li, it's the opposite. For the writer, ultimately, reality catches up with you. Life is more important than art. So it's reflected in the ending. I hope I'm not spoiling anything in there. Spoiler alert. Farewell, My Concubine. It's a bit like a palimpsest. Palimpsest is this manuscript where you write over and over until the original words are erased and something new comes in, but you can still read the original writing. Originally, there's a massive work called The Chronicles of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian. It's like the guy is the first historian, I guess you could say, in China. In particular, one of the most exciting parts of that massive work, is pretty long, is his depiction of the true, what's called in English, true Han contention. So it's a civil war, basically, at the end of the first dynasty, the Qin dynasty. The two protagonists were the king of Chu, his name was Xiongyu, and Liu Bang, who went on to become the first emperor of the Han dynasty. Spoiler alert. At the time when the odds start to stagger against him, Xiongyu has this concubine. She's just one line in that epic history, but as centuries went by, the story became more and more amplified. 1,800 years later, in the Ming Dynasty, the stage play genre becomes quite central, not central, but very important. The tables are kind of turned, and the concubine become much more important in the story. Then the king doesn't really matter anymore. You flash forward another 300-400 years later, you have the man, Mei Lanfang, who pretty much reinvented Beijing opera genre. It's really the guy who made Beijing opera known outside of China. So I think it's accurate to say. In his vastly expanded version, it's not farewell, my concubine. It's the concubine bids adieu to her king, because it's so much about the concubine at this point. And so that is the version that is told in the Farewell, My Concubine film. And that has an impact on the role played by Leslie Cheung. One of his top 5 performances of all time. It became iconic. At the time when Leslie Cheung was approached for the part, he already had this big career. In the 1980s, he was this massive star. Leslie Cheung embodies Hong Kong in this on so many levels. Now, like the way retrospectively we see that now Leslie Cheung has become an icon of gay culture. So that's certainly a dimension to take into account when you talk about the film. And again, I think this is mostly remembered as a gay drama, but I talked about the philosophical dimension of it, the difference between life and art. I think it's also embodied in Leslie Cheung's performance. You have an example of a very embodied performance in this, making you really question like what is art, what is pretend part of the performance, and what is real. And when I find Farewell, My Concubine great, and I do believe that's a characteristic of great artworks, it's the way it raises the question. But it does not quite solve it. You have this sort of conflict between what you are as a person. So that's a line that's really central to the film. I am by nature a girl and not a boy. A character you play become what you are. I think that's we talk a lot about method acting in America, right? Like the identification with a character. But if you essentially you ask an actor to be a very good liar, you're lying. You're creating something out of nothing just with words. But as you express those words, you express a certain emotion. That emotion take over what you are. So it's not just acting as if, you act that emotion. You have to, for the art to be effective, you have to act jealous, to act that jealousy. And so in turn, you become jealous yourself. So that's a process you see very clearly. It's interesting because you have an art form, the Beijing opera, which is not directly mimetic, meaning it's not directly representative. Like it's very stylized. You have that very specific way of placing your voice in a very high pitch, right? So, in a sense, quite remote from reality, but you express an emotion. And through the process of expressing the emotion becomes you and becomes more real. The character played by Cheung really becomes the concubine, really becomes a woman. Like that sentence, I who am by nature a girl and not a boy, becomes real in the course of his life as well. It becomes pretty much a woman in this sense. But that's a question that's asked throughout. It's like you have to deal with the contingencies of life, making a living. Like at some point when history has it so that the Beijing opera art form becomes out of fashion. So you worry about material concerns, such as making a living. I think that's one of the most interesting parts about the film, that raises some rather central questions to all of us who care about film and art in general. And that's all I have to say.